Hey everybody, Jason here. On my way to work, and I was thinking about game mechanics, and I figured I should probably record this in case something good came out of my mouth, and I wanted to remember it for later. But I was thinking to myself, what is it that we as gamers in our hobby, what is it about us that draws us to certain types of game systems mechanically? Game systems mechanically. Like, what is it about something mechanically that makes us feel like it's appropriate for a genre or an IP or something to that effect? Like, we're always questing to find the perfect system. Some of us are anyway, not everybody. Some people are content to find one thing and play with just that one thing the rest of their lives. But I'm the type of person that I search for systems constantly, or I want to modify things and change things, and more so design than modify. I'm weird, I guess, in that way that I don't like to modify an existing system. I would rather create a new system, which maybe that's part of my problem. But I mean, some of us are always questing to find the right mechanic. And I'm just wondering, I've been wondering to myself, there's no answer. I'm sure there's really no answer to that question. But I just wonder why some of us are on this endless quest to find the perfect set of mechanics for us. And for some of us, it's not just the perfect set of mechanics, it's the perfect set of mechanics, like I said before, as defined by, or that makes you feel like a certain genre or IP or something like that. Like, you could take an existing set of mechanics that might be science fiction or science fiction and fantasy, for example, but would not feel like Star Wars. Or you could take a certain set of mechanics that are for Star Wars, an existing Star Wars game, and insert them into another type of sci-fi, and it just doesn't feel right. Or you could, there's a million different fantasy games out there, but the ones that are not D20, as far as being different systems, story-wise, I know some game worlds are more fleshed out, some stories are more appealing to other people than others, and things like that, but, as a blanket genre, fantasy is fantasy. So, what is it about certain mechanics that make fantasy feel like fantasy? Is it just because we were introduced to fantasy with the D20 system back in the day with D&D? Obviously, fantasy D20 is going to feel a little different than fantasy D6 versus fantasy played with the Genesis core book from Fantasy Flight Games. Versus even different types of D20, whether it's OSR or 4th edition or 2nd edition or 5th edition, all of them feel different. And there's no right or wrong system. Everybody prefers a different thing, and that's totally cool. And there are good and bad things about every system, so just because you don't like one system doesn't mean you dislike everything about it. There could be something very cool about, say, 4th edition, which I know a lot of people didn't like 4th edition D&D. I've only played it solo with the original beginner box, and I enjoyed it for what it was. I don't know that I would enjoy playing that in a long-term campaign where we level up, to epic levels and everything, just based on how most characters seem to feel the same. But again, I could be completely wrong about that, so I shouldn't really judge it that way. That's just how it feels on paper. But there could be things about 4th edition that I really love that I don't like about 5th edition, which I like 5th edition for the most part. But there's some geese out here flapping their wings at cars that drive by. There are things about 5th edition that I don't really care for. Maybe those things I could bring in from other systems like 4th or 2nd or whatever, and Frankenstein up a little system that I would really, really enjoy a lot more than I do. But that's D&D is just an easy example because that's the genre or the IP that everybody's familiar with. If you were to take a somewhat generic fantasy game based on a series of books that, I don't want to say generic, but something that's not as well fleshed out because there's a million different splat books for it, like D&D. Something that is a little more generic of a system. There's a little more open world left to create yourself because the books don't have a million, like I said, million splat books or box sets or whatever. If you take something that's a generic fantasy world and you pick and pull mechanics from it and Frankenstein it up a little bit, will it still feel like that same game that you originally read? There's 3 different versions of the Judge Dredd role-playing game out. As far as I know, all of them are drastically different. I haven't played all of them. In fact, I've only read 1 book, and I haven't even read it all the way, and that's the new one that uses the What's Old is New system, which I seem to, for being a dice pool system, I like it. It seems really interesting, and it's kind of cool. But I believe one of them was based on Traveler. One of the Judge Dredd games was based on Traveler, I think. I think the other one was based on D20, and the new one, like I said, is What's Old is New, which is a D6 dice pool system. I don't know anything about Traveler. I'm more than familiar with D20, as most of us are. So I don't know how well you could pick and pull and match up different things from those different systems, but you might be able to Frankenstein up a system using those 3 separate systems, mechanics-wise, to make something that doesn't feel like any Judge Dredd game. If you've played all 3 of those, it doesn't feel like any of them, but might feel more like Judge Dredd than any of the 3 that already exist. Or you could take, for example, Fantasy Flight Games' Genesis system and run Judge Dredd with that. That might work really, really well. I don't know. That book is pretty bare bones, even for a generic system. It's more of a toolkit than a system. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just what it is. I have the book. I've read part of it. I read most of it, actually. And it's good. I like it. I would definitely run it. I've ran the Final Fantasy. I always say Final Fantasy. I don't know why the hell I do that. Fantasy Flight. Jesus. The Fantasy Flight Star Wars system, I've ran that a couple times. And I really enjoy it a lot. I think it's a great system, and it works really, really well for Star Wars. So I can only imagine how well it works for other genres and things like that. It's got to work really well. I bet you could do a really good Tron game with it. That would be fun. I think I would love to play an EverQuest game with the Genesis system. I think that would be super freaking awesome. I think it could handle a lot of things really well. I think there's some things that might not handle very well at all, especially if you're into games like D&D. If you want your fantasy to be the type of, mechanically, the type of thing where you level up and gain new abilities, new powers, new skills, and not only that, but your equipment is a big part of D&D. Well, in Star Wars, equipment's not a big deal. It's not like a character growth mechanic. It never, even in the D20 games or D6 games, there was lots of options, but they weren't really that different mechanically, so that's not a big thing, which fits the genre. Star Wars was never about leveling up and getting better equipment, better armor, better weapons. Armor didn't really seem to do anything in Star Wars because it was an aesthetic. It wasn't like a plot device. Armor didn't really protect you like you would think that it should. It just looked, it was there because it looked cool, not because it worked or protected you. But in certain styles of fantasy, namely D&D and EverQuest, it's a video game, so of course equipment plays a big role in leveling up, more powerful equipment, crafting, things like that. So in Genesis, that aspect of it might not be very well adapted, and it might feel like it's not necessarily a part of the genre if that's how you look at importance of genre gear and stuff. So mechanically, you might say, the pre-existing EverQuest game for D20, based on 3.5 rules, from what little of it I played, felt very much like EverQuest, because EverQuest, the video game, was basically built on Dungeons and Dragons, the system, you know, the stats, leveling up, getting better equipment. I mean, it was really D&D in video game form, which tons of video games are basically D&D in video game form. So that's not anything new. But there was so much lore and story and things like that in EverQuest that I think you probably could run a Genesis version or D6 version, or, you know, what's old is new version, or whatever, in EverQuest that feels like EverQuest, even if you don't have the thing where you gain millions of levels and, you know, up to a level 100, and gain, you know, 6 or 7 different sets of armor that you keep, and 9 or 10 different weapons that you carry around for different situations and things you're going to fight and all that stuff. Excuse me. Even if you don't have that aspect of the game, you could still probably run a game that feels very much EverQuest. So and maybe I've veered off topic, which I probably have, because I do that a lot, but it was a train of thought that I had that I wanted to record. So yeah, what is it that drives us to find a new mechanics system for different things? Some of us really enjoy 5th edition D&D, but also really enjoy different versions of fantasy, like non-D20 versions of fantasy, like D6 or whatever. And we get a craving to play certain genres just with different systems. Like, I want to play D20 fantasy, I want to play D6 fantasy, I want to play dice pool fantasy, I want to play Genesis fantasy, I want to play Symbaroum, which is kind of OSR anyway, so maybe that's an example. But there's just different fantasies I want to play, but at different times my gut just wants to play. I'm just drawn to different systems of it. So what is it? I wonder what it is about that makes us crave different systems, even if it's for the same genre. Anyway, I'm at work, and that was a rambling video that didn't really say a whole lot. So if you made it this far, I apologize, and also I thank you. So anyway, hope you guys are having a good day and a good week, and we'll talk to you later.